Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about how climate will affect crops, but crops affect climate themselves, and they do this in two ways. First of all, about 1/4 of the land's surface is used for growing crops. Another 10–15% are used for pasture, so a substantial amount of the land's surface is used in crop and agricultural production. And how we use that land affects our climate. If we were, for example, to deforest a substantial area and replace it with an annual crop such as soybean, then we would alter the characteristics of the land's surface, alter the way that water and heat flows from the land's surface to the atmosphere and back, and ultimately change the regional climate if there's a large enough change to the land's surface. So this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that's really quite difficult to understand because of the complexity. It's difficult because it needs us as crop scientists to work even more closely with our climate scientist colleagues. And it's difficult because we have to join our models together.
It is projected that people are going to suffer from a serious food crisis for the next 30 years until 2030, unless immediate action is taken. It is increasingly clear that there is an impending global food emergency that could have long-term impacts on hundreds of millions of children and adults. We must double the yield of our production by increasing 100% to feed a growing global population and to cater for the future demand of food. This is an urgent matter, and it is quite frightening. About 50 million people risk falling into extreme poverty this year. People should elevate food production now. Scientists have predicted an increase in food production of 30% to 50% for developing countries in the next 3 years. There will be an increase of the cost of the production. There is also an opportunity for developing countries to improve food systems alongside reducing poverty and increasing global resilience to shocks.
Why do we need to recycle water?
Because we don't generate much new water. Chemically, the process of generating water, which is to basically taking hydrogen and oxygen and burning them to produce water, is not a process that happens a lot anymore. So in terms of our total volume of water in the world, yes, it is changing, but it's not changing significantly relative to the rate at which we are using or demanding fresh new water.
Now, there are a lot of different areas of technology involved in water recycling, and we are later in the interview going to get to industrial use and the reclamation of sewage. What about in the home at the moment? What sort of technology is being utilised in the home when we talk about water recycling?
Well, very little on average. Typically, in a modern home, we turn on the tap, we take a glass of water, we probably, in turning on that tap, flush 10 glasses of water down the sink. We take a shower, we use fresh water, we do a whole range of things, and there is nominally very little recycling of that. It goes down the drain and it goes off to a wastewater treatment plant. There is actually very, very little recycling at a local level. People don't actually say, well, I'm now going to take the water I just used, put it through a sophisticated process and reuse it and have a closed loop. It's not a closed loop in the home.
Why should we read The Republic? I imagine lots of students ask this question to themselves when they're given it as a set book at the beginning of their university course. But in fact, there are many good reasons to read The Republic. And the first one I would pick on is just that it is immensely readable. It's not, Plato did not write philosophy like a dry textbook. He wrote it like a living conversation. The whole of The Republic, which is a fairly fat book, is a living conversation written in short, almost soundbite type answers, but nevertheless developing some very, very important ideas. So my first answer then, we should read The Republic just because it is readable. It was written by a genius and it's worth reading. It's easy to read. It's not difficult. But then there's also obviously the thought, the content of the book. And he's asking this absolutely fundamental question: why should we bother to be good? What's in it for us, effectively? It seems, when we look at the world, it looks as though injustice pays, it looks as though crime pays, whereas the good people get trodden down. So Plato addresses this absolutely fundamental question: why should we be good? I'm not going to tell you his answer. Read the book.
The history of software is, of course, very, very new. The whole IT industry is really only 60-70 years old, which is extraordinary. To be so close to the birth of a major new technology, a major new discipline, is quite remarkable given where we've got to in those 67 years. And the progression has been not so much a progression as a stampede. Because Moore's law, the rapid expansion in the power of computing and the rapid fall of the cost of computing and storage and communications has made it feasible for information technology to move into all sorts of areas of life that were never originally envisaged. What has happened is that there has been, as I said, a stampede for people to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that is what's guided the development of software and information technology over the past decades, and continues to do so, with a number of consequences that we will explore.
Internet was invented by people who were good at programming, and people kept optimizing it for different purposes. So Internet has been growing organically. Internet can achieve many things, but has advantages and disadvantages. The email system was designed by graduate students and researchers who know and trust each other. Using email needs trust between the senders and receivers, as the authentication process was not originally built into the system. Email authentication is a technical solution to proving that an email is not forged. In other words, it provides a way to verify that an email comes from who it claims to be from. Email authentication is most often used to block harmful or fraudulent uses of email, such as phishing and spam. In practice, we use the term email authentication to refer to technical standards that make this verification possible. Initially, the email system didn't consider security because there was no suspicion between them at that time, and there was no authentication process built into this system.
English, as you've already read, is not a pure language. I don't think there really are any pure languages in the world, but English is definitely not a pure language. English, in fact, has borrowed from over 350 languages in its history. So it's a variety of many languages. Some people say it's like a dog, a mongrel dog, a dog that's been made up of many different dogs. The English language is like that. And by looking at the history of the English language, we learn about the history of the English people. The two things are closely connected. So in fact, today we're not only learning about language, but we're learning about history. And the fact that English has borrowed words from over 350 languages has been viewed differently throughout history. So for example, in Shakespeare's time, people were very angry about words which were not, they thought, original English words, words which came from other languages. They didn't like them.
Rejection happens to all of us, and it can be a disappointing experience. I will now give you some advice for young researchers. Many things have changed today, which can be a troubling issue. The chance of getting paper published is becoming smaller and smaller. Although it never is easy to take, rejection is particularly hard at the beginning of your career. But rejections will lead to a better result and will be good for the career path. Use this feedback to improve your paper for submission to another journal, as well as your next, more robust study of the topic. Using several individuals with expertise in the topic have donated substantial time to provide detailed advice to advance your paper and future work. Also, remember that publication does not mean funding. Investors will learn how to attract and engage young researchers at the same time. Today, this course you're going to take is about what is engineering and how to work with a complicated system. You guys should know the answers because all of you guys are from the engineering course, especially when you design, build, debug, and develop something new during these processes. You are working with the complicated system. So how to program complicated systems, and how would you know it actually works before producing it? Sometimes the inspirations are from your daily life. You probably need to consider your personal life experience. And from the common everyday life to the tiny things that you cannot see virtually, and the inspirations normally exist in the tiny levels. A complicated system such as your laptops running Microsoft systems. That means the system is not able to see, which means you guys have to virtualize it. Engineering is here to help virtualize by using systems. Nowadays, the complicated systems are relatively reliable, and you guys work upon these and need to deliver the new outcomes which are reliable as well. This is what we do now, and we are good at it. Engineering is to help virtualize by using systems. In order to develop and produce a reliable system, you need to consider more on the risks, potentials, predictability, and accuracy. The United States is considered the biggest food-wasting country in the world. Consumers collectively throw away more than all the retailers together in the U.S. In total, private U.S. households waste around 43% of all food. According to Save the Food, a national public service campaign, this could translate into an annual financial loss of $1,500 for a family of 4. In fact, over 40 million tons of food ends up in landfills every year, worth more than $161 billion. 60% of food waste comes from general consumption. There are two main sources of food waste. The majority of food waste comes from supermarkets, especially in the used-by section. The other factor is what people purchase and how they eat. So purchasing all items is not a good idea. Avoiding food waste efficiently along the supply chain and in all our households can result in a win-win scenario. Having food waste could help meet the demand for nutrition of our growing population and equally minimize the negative environmental effects of agriculture.
Today our course is an introduction to modern poetry, which remains an important part of art and culture. Poetry is probably the oldest form of literature and predates the origin of writing itself. The oldest written manuscripts we have are poems, mostly epic poems telling the stories of ancient mythology. They have long been written according to fairly strict rules of meter and rhyme, with each culture having its own set of these rules. In this class we'll be studying several poets in detail. They all reward and demand a certain amount of close reading. So you need to gain some sense of modernism as one of the richest fields in English language writing. The English language in poetry is difficult to understand, leaving readers frustrated and puzzled, and making it difficult to enjoy. This is because the poems have unique literal structures which use literary expressions. Besides, poems are too informative and too demanding. Therefore, I am encouraging you to learn a simple one at first. What I'm requesting you to do is capture the poem in detail after this class.
This is a new memory-learning memory. It is a good thing for you to get enough sleep, and a bad thing for you if not. People need to sleep before learning, and people also need to sleep after learning. When you are asleep, the memory can consolidate all the information into your brain. From this point, it may only get worse. Not only will I tell you about the wonderfully good things that happen when you get to sleep, but the alarmingly bad things that happen when you don't get enough, both for your brain and for your body. Let me start with the brain and the functions of learning and memory, because what we've discovered over the past 10 years or so is that you need sleep after learning to essentially hit the save button on those new memories so that you don't forget. But recently, we discovered that you also need to sleep before learning, and now to actually prepare your brain almost like a dry sponge, ready to initially soak up new information. And without sleep, the memory circuits of the brain essentially become waterlogged, as it were, and you can't absorb new memories.
I suppose you wouldn't expect perhaps to find a mathematician in a museum of historical objects, but actually the objects that I've been drawn to in this museum have quite a lot of mathematical significance. These Neolithic stones discovered in Scotland, dating back 5,000 years, are probably the first examples of humans exploring the concept of symmetry. And that's what I do as a practicing mathematician. I spend my life trying to understand what symmetries are possible in nature and in mathematics and abstractly. And here, I've got a connection going back 5,000 years to people who are already trying to understand how can I arrange patches on the side of these stone balls in a symmetrical manner. One of the intriguing things about these stones is that we don't actually know what they're for. They might have been for divination, trying to predict the future. They might have been part of a game. They look very much like dice, but we don't really think there's any game associated with them. Maybe they were just for chucking around. They're very nice in the hand when you hold them. Or maybe they were symbols of power in the clan. I suppose that's why I like them, because we don't really know what they are.
The rapid expansion of the internet has revolutionized our lives, influencing both the quality and quantity of interactions and information accessibility. One significant change is in the realm of research. Online research offers several advantages, such as speed, cost efficiency, and the ability to reach diverse or otherwise inaccessible groups. These features have made it a cornerstone of modern studies and data collection, enabling researchers to gather vast amounts of information quickly. However, this shift to online methods is not without challenges. One major drawback is the lack of face-to-face communication, which eliminates the ability to interpret body language or other nonverbal cues that are essential for understanding context and intent. Additionally, the anonymity of the internet means researchers cannot always verify the identity of participants, leading to potential issues with data reliability and authenticity. As online research continues to grow, balancing its advantages with strategies to mitigate its shortcomings will be crucial for maintaining the quality and credibility of studies conducted in the digital age.
We are from an organization called Non-Human Rights Project, and we fight for legal rights of non-human animals. Drawing a line in order to enslave an autonomous and self-determining being is a violation of equality. We then searched through 80 jurisdictions. We chose the state of New York. Then we decided upon who our plaintiffs are going to be. We decided upon chimpanzees. We know the extraordinary cognitive capabilities that they have, and they also resemble the kind that human beings have. And so we chose chimpanzees, and we began to then canvass the world to find the experts in the chimpanzee cognition. So now we need to find our chimpanzees. Our chimpanzee, first we found 2 of them in the state of New York. Both of them would die before we could even get our suits filed. Then we found Tommy. Tommy is a chimpanzee. Tommy was a chimpanzee. We found him in that cage. We found him in a small room that was filled with cages in a larger warehouse structure on a used trailer lot in central New York. And so on the last day of the week, December 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project filed 3 suits all across the state of New York, using the same common law argument. The court didn't approve our appeal because they think chimpanzees are not humans, even though they have cognitive skills. We proved to the court that chimpanzees also have cognitive capabilities, and that they were not hearing us.
My lab works on the applications of synthetic biology, so we're very interested in doing useful things with biological systems. Up to now, life has evolved, and now we actually have the ability and the power to engineer it, to design it. And so I'm curious about what the natural world is going to look like in the future. So synthetic biology is sort of the next level of genetic engineering. So about 40 years ago, we, being scientists and engineers, developed the techniques to basically move pieces of DNA from one organism to another. And this was sort of done by physically cutting and pasting. Now we're moving beyond that, where we can write DNA. So we're no longer limited to the pieces we can cut from one and put in another. We can chemically synthesize this DNA on a machine and put that into an organism. And now we can even create new organisms completely from scratch. So if you imagine a cell that's programmed to make a useful compound, say a material or a drug, then what you have is basically a micro-scale manufacturing unit. It's basically a cellular factory, and the cool thing about a cellular factory is that when you want more factories, you let that cell grow and divide. So in the lab, if we have one bacteria, we put it in a flask, the next day we come in, we have millions, if not billions, of bacteria.
There are a number of possible purposes for a social network. You now have a good understanding of how to analyze the basic characteristics of your social network, or that of another individual. Network is a social relationship which helps transfer information, such as traveling from one place to another. It also helps people get to different destinations more quickly if they need to travel a long distance or 2 destinations. It is suitable for old cities with high-density populations, like Paris. There are thousands of trips and too many travelers every day in Paris. The transportation network in Paris provides thousands of public services and links them together. A good network can help people with long-distance or multi-destination trips. In cities with high-density populations such as Paris, people would be better carefully planning their journeys by looking at the routes of their network in advance to reduce the density of commuters at the same time.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices, and they could build a city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way that was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and they everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns, they would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum or military camp design.
Honeybees do a waggle dance to direct other bees to sources of nectar. But dancing bees like this one can be halted by a headbutt from another bee. Now researchers have found that this headbutt is actually a warning signal. A feeding station was set up in the lab to mimic a source of nectar. Then foraging bees were introduced to dangers at the station, such as competition from rival colonies. When foragers returned to the hive, they stopped bees dancing. Scientists think the behavior warns dancers of a dangerous source of nectar.
Globalization is an overused and often misunderstood concept. We hear it all the time on news broadcasts and in any type of public discussion, but the starting point for understanding globalization is that it is industries and markets that globalize, not countries. So that's why it's helpful to think of globalization as the integration of economic activities across borders. But why does globalization matter? I would argue that globalization matters because it means the rise of interconnectedness between countries and markets across the world. For example, one of the reasons why the financial crash of 2007, 2008 was so serious was because the financial and banking systems of countries around the world have become so closely interconnected with the globalization of markets.
Low achievers are more likely to drop out of school. Some boys leave school early. And the main reason is push and pull factors. The main reason of pull is that the economy and market provide many job opportunities for boys with mainly two destinations, shipping and traineeship. So dropping from school is not absolutely bad for boys. But girls don't have the same opportunities. Girls are less likely to leave school because fewer jobs are available for them. The transmission is hard. So for girls, dropping from school is completely bad. And if they do so, they can either get part-time jobs or just stay unemployed. The ocean provides habitat for 98% fish, the source of protein feeding 4.8 billion people. But human activities and climate change have left corals bleached in some oceans. There are many species of fish that are endangered. The government set up a network called MPA Marine Campaign, in which countries and organizations have been collaborating with each other to protect the environment for 32 years. A marine protected area, an MPA, is a zone designated and managed to protect marine habitats and species for the good of the ocean, society, economy, and culture. Within MPAs, human activities such as fishing, vessel traffic, and tourism are regulated. MPAs can come in the form of a fully protected marine reserve, a moderately protected marine park, or a no-take zone, among others. But MPA is faced with lots of challenges, as some developing countries lack management and resources and feel excluded. Social skills are vital in enabling an individual to have and maintain positive interactions with others. Many of these skills are crucial in making and sustaining friendships. Social interactions do not always run smoothly, and an individual needs to be able to implement appropriate strategies, such as conflict resolution, when difficulties in interactions arise. It is also important for individuals to have empathy, as it allows them to respond to an understanding and caring way to how others are feeling. Children are facing social difficulties with particular risks. Young people who do not have strong relationships with the adults in their family are at even more risk. An experiment in high school, which lasted for 8 to 12 weeks, the students were told to be a movie director and to choose their own story structure. The students worked with each other, which involved lots of different skills and social interactivity. The movies they had made were actually cool. Then, the researchers tested the intervention effect, finding this can improve their self-regulation, and they found this can improve their self-regulation and critical thinking skills. Design of buildings is important according to architectural textbooks. At its roots, architecture exists to create the physical environment in which people live, but architecture is more than just the built environment. It's also part of our culture. It stands as a representation of how we see ourselves, as well as how we see the world. There are poorly designed buildings, but also some great building works. In the Victoria area, architects designed buildings based on bricks and other materials. The design of flaws was based on lighting, as it would not only affect appearance but also health conditions. The materials that buildings are made of also matter. For example, the design of ground floors must ensure that the building is able to withstand the weight of the higher levels. In the 20th century, many old buildings with design flaws were demolished or modified through a natural selection process, which means they are an altered state rather than an original state. This is an application of Darwin's theory of natural selection to modification of old buildings, which means buildings should adapt to the new world to survive or be pulled down. So, it's argued to be unfair to criticize the demolition, although some people believe that whether to be remain should be decided based on their nature and functions. As the world became more and more connected, the styles evolved. But even in modern construction, there is still an importance in honoring the cultural nuances in the built environment.
The question today of, what makes a luxury brand and how do we distinguish it is very hard to answer. The standard business response is to say they are more exclusive. And we get exclusivity by having high price and relatively small amounts of the product available. The reality, however, of luxury brands is they're sold in their millions, and in some cases are not priced that much higher than the standard output. The only way I can really answer your question is to say it's all relative. As you said in your introduction, it wasn't that long ago in Australia that we would have considered 2 televisions to be a luxury, or even further back, 1 colour television. And you can make a strong argument, for example, that Starbucks in China right now is a luxury purchase because of its cost, because of how frequently it's purchased by many people. So I think the long answer is a complicated one, but the answer is it depends who you talk to. I think in the business community, what we would say is there are a small cluster of more expensive brands which have a distinct strategy that we would identify as being luxury brands. And they start with the Rolls-Royces and the Tiffany's and the Louis Vuittons of the world. And I think that tends to be how we see them.
The Internet, the most powerful tool in terms of engineering made by humans, has the most complicated structure. What we call the Internet is made up of a lot of things: wires traversing the ocean, satellites and cell phone towers, massive data centers sending packets of information all over, and devices. The Internet can be connected via a modem or an ADSL switch center to a local landline telephone exchange network. It could connect us from Sydney to Melbourne and then to the U.S. However, it takes energy for the transmission system to transmit information. For example, the longer email you write, the more energy is consumed. Meanwhile, there are more than 30 billion things connected to the Internet, like cell phones, laptops, credit card readers, smart TV, and so on, and each of them requires electricity. In total, Internet-connected devices probably use around 5% of the world's electricity. And most of the electricity comes from burning fossil fuels, which release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The stock market is where investors connect to buy and sell investments, most commonly stocks, which are shares of ownership in a public company. When you need groceries, you go to the supermarket. When you're ready to buy stocks or mutual funds, you'll usually buy them online to the stock market, which anyone can access with a brokerage account or employee retirement plan. The term stock market often refers to one of the major stock market indexes. However, there are some different uses of the stock market before and after. In the 18th century, manufacturing companies came into the market. Traditional companies used stocks to raise money and input money into companies, while modern companies use stocks to output money. From the 19th to 20th century, however, modern companies such as Apple, Google, and Microsoft are big enough to earn money and use stocks differently. The stock market also inclined to put money into big companies.
A leader can define or clarify goals by issuing a memo or an executive order, an edict, or a fatwa or a tweet, by passing a law, barking a command, or presenting an interesting idea in a meeting of colleagues. Leaders can mobilize people's energies in ways that range from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or the use of deadly force. Sometimes a charismatic leader such as Martin Luther King Jr. can define goals and mobilize energies through rhetoric and the power of example. We can think of leadership as a spectrum in terms of both visibility and the power the leader wields. On one end of the spectrum, we have the most visible, authoritative leaders like the President of the United States, or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or a dictator such as Hitler or Gaddafi. At the opposite end of the spectrum is casual, low-key leadership found in countless situations every day around the world, leadership that can make a significant difference to the individuals whose lives are touched by it. Over the centuries, the first kind, the out-in-front, authoritative leadership, has generally been exhibited by men. Some men in positions of great authority, including Nelson Mandela, have chosen a strategy of leading from behind. More often, however, top leaders have been quite visible in their exercise of power. Women, as well as some men, have provided casual, low-key leadership behind the scenes. But this pattern has been changing as more women have taken up opportunities for visible, authoritative leadership.
Well, a historical linguist compares languages at several levels. You start out looking for basic vocabulary. All languages of the world, natural languages at least, have words for eye and head and nose and ear, and for sky and earth, and for water, sand, and for sibling, mother and father. They may not have words for uncle and aunt. It becomes much vaguer because in one culture an aunt is different when it comes from your father's side than from your mother's side. You don't include snow. Most people know what snow is, but in the tropics you don't have it. So you look for notions that are totally comparable and that occur everywhere in the world. You take the 100 or 200 most universal notions in a human life. That is what you call a basic vocabulary. So you take basic vocabularies in languages that you think are related. You look for words that sound the same.
Approach and avoidance motivation is composed of three conceptually distinct components. Approach indicates a propensity to move toward or maintain contact with a desired stimulus, such as vocational plans. Avoidance indicates a propensity to move away from or maintain distance from an undesired stimulus in order to reduce anxiety.
Motivation is defined as the energization and direction of behavior.
The valence of stimuli is at the core of the distinction between approach and avoidance, with positively valent stimuli typically leading to approach and negatively valent stimuli typically leading to avoidance. Stimuli can be external or internal, implicit or explicit, conscious or non-conscious.
Around the world, renewable energy use is on the rise. And these alternative energy sources could hold the key to combating climate change. What is renewable energy? Renewable energy is generated from sources that naturally replenish themselves and never run out. The most common sources are solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Over 80% of the total energy consumed by humans is derived from fossil fuels. However, renewables are the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Renewable energy has many benefits. First, it can combat climate change because it creates no direct greenhouse gas emissions. The only emissions that they produce are indirect, meaning those that result from manufacturing parts, installation, operation, and maintenance. But even those are minimal.
A research on 7,000 young students and children in the United Kingdom is about how they participate in their communities, how they form values with character education, and what influences them the most. The outcome involves parents, friends, schools, and siblings. And researchers figure out which factors are essential and more important than others. Successful schools depend on the resources and support of their communities, and schools at the center of their communities are often the most successful schools. In turn, schools are vital to the social health of their local communities. Also, families are the first social unit in which children learn and develop. Good parenting can take different forms and be shaped by various social and cultural forces, but it invariably involves providing children with the support, care, love, guidance, and protection that set the conditions for healthy physical, mental, and social development. The research has also attracted attention and interest from many national policymakers and contacted me.
So I think you all know what I mean by globalization, don't you? This is the idea that we all live in a global village. With instant communications, we can share ideas and consume cultural artifacts from countries all around the world just by going on the internet and all dream up, basically. The world is shrinking. In terms of speeds, it is accelerating, but in terms of distance, it's shrinking. What do I mean by de-traditionalization? I mean the disappearance or the erosion, for the better word to use, the erosion of traditional values, of conventional ways of doing things, of conventional moralities. More and more young people around the world are rejecting the culture they grew up in, and it's probably a little bit cruel, but some imitating a Hollywood model of society rather than one which they inherit from their local tradition background. Okay?
Organization studies seem to draw on the whole family of social sciences, clearly psychology, clearly sociology, but also economics, anthropology, politics, as we said, philosophy to a degree, history, sometimes literary studies, cultural studies, so on and so forth. I think that's absolutely right. And for me, that's absolutely the pleasure, and even on good days, the joy of doing organization studies, because it enables you, not just enables, but requires you in some sense, to have some kind of broad familiarization of that sort. Now, there's a price to be paid for that, because that kind of breadth, if you like, does come, I suppose, as the cost of depth. And I guess there would be people who are clearly within academic disciplines or sociology or economics or whatever, who might say, well, these are sort of magpie-shish, amateurish kind of forays into our territory. You know, I wouldn't necessarily disown that idea. But I think that what studying organizations teaches us and teaches me is actually the artificiality of those academic subdivisions. And as soon as we start to actually think about something like the organized world, then immediately, the kinds of things that come into focus are things have traditionally been studied by different demands. And so, I think it's a liberating idea, the idea that we don't need to be bound by those strictures and structures of disciplinary division, and that we can be free actually to imagine and think about the social world through an agglomeration of techniques and ideas and theories and concepts from across the social sciences.
There can now be no reasonable science-based doubt about the reality of global climate change effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of so-called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by amounts of mass panic and what to do about it. To many of Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at the time and later from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can the world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? Is it not in everyone's interest to apply the precautionary principle in attempting to avoid the worst of their predictions, now rather than at some future time? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rajendra Pachauri has recently pointed out, 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12 years, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale.
The concept of self-domestication in animals, particularly dogs, is quite intriguing. One prominent theory suggests that dogs began their domestication journey by scavenging around human settlements, especially garbage dumps. This theory posits that less aggressive wolves were more successful at scavenging near humans, leading to a natural selection process favoring those with friendlier and more cooperative traits. However, some researchers argue against this dump theory. They suggest that the domestication of dogs was more complex and involved active cooperation and emotional bonds between humans and wolves long before the existence of human waste dumps. This perspective highlights the psychological and neurobiological similarities between humans and dogs that facilitated their close relationship. Overall, the self-domestication hypothesis emphasizes that the evolution of dogs from wolves was likely driven by a combination of factors, including reduced aggression and increased sociability.
With the concept of moral objectivism, what we're looking at is the idea that there can be some universal moral principles, some rules, some ideas, and guidelines that are valid for all people in all social environments and all situations. The idea that we can essentially have some signposts or a roadmap to guide behavior is going to be consistent across all individuals. Now, if we take a look at this in another perspective, we can come up with a view of moral absolutism. In the area of moral absolutism, basically, what we have is illustrated on the right-hand side of this slide is a very firm and unyielding boundary between what is right and what is wrong. And so, within moral absolutism, basically what you have are these non-overridable principles. They must be followed. They must never be violated, and there were no exceptions. It is always right, it is always wrong, and nothing is subject to interpretation, and nothing is dependent upon the situation. So the topic for today is abstraction. And this is a very important layer of computer because you can't do anything with a computer unless you have a symbolic system in place, right? So we're talking about the origin of symbolic systems. Language is a classic symbolic system. Apparently one theory for why language evolved is that people communicated with sign language and with movement quite well for a long time. And it turned out they wanted to communicate even while they were doing things. So, while they were trying to strangle the dinosaur, not the dinosaurs, the rhinoceros, they wanted to say, "Come help me." And they used sign language to do it. They had to let go of the rhinoceros, and the rhinoceros ran away. So you can see that it's a good idea to be able to do something with your hands and be able to communicate at the same time. Hence, there comes words and language. Because of the economic model, the newspaper industry has been shrinking drastically from the last 50 years of the 20th century in some states of America. Also, as the economic model changed, newspapers increased the cash flow. However, there are still some newspaper industries losing money because of a decrease in advertising and buyers. They can't find buyers. Only a few newspapers have positive cash flow. Over 100 newspapers with cash flow in red have had no money to publish the newspaper every day. Some of them published 3 days per week. Small-sized newspapers only published once a week and had to go online. Some newspapers even disappeared. The staff working in the newspaper industry decreased by 30 to 60% or more.
The Human Rights Act can be seen as far-reaching, Some would argue controversial in the UK's history of rights. At the same time, it can be described as a somewhat cautious document that provides the starting point for a wider application of law to rights. In many ways, the freedom protections contained in the Human Rights Act were not new to people in the UK. The Act puts into UK law most of the clauses of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Convention itself was devised following the end of the Second World War by the Council of Europe. UK law has played a significant role in the drafting of the Convention, and the UK was among the first governments to ratify the Convention in 1951. Rights are sometimes described as being of a positive or a negative nature. That's to say, some can be expressed as a right to and others as freedom from. The 1998 Act puts into place 15 specific rights and freedoms, which include rights to liberty and security, a free trial, free expression, free elections, and the right to marry and found a family. There are also freedoms from torture, from slavery or forced labor, and from discrimination on grounds such as race, sex, religion, political opinion, or social origin. The Human Rights Act has been described as the start of a process. The Act itself does not expand on the provisions made by the European Convention, which some would consider as following a baseline or a minimum standard for human rights.